Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we visit one of the most significant maritime accidents of the Middle Ages, when William Adelin, grandson of William the Conqueror and the only legitimate male heir to the throne of England, was killed with the sinking of the White Ship in 1120. His death would have dramatic consequences for the European continent and English history. But what if it had all gone differently? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
In 1066, the entire history of England pivoted upon the successful invasion of Duke William of Normandy, whom we now call William the Conqueror. But the politics of power are complex, and after his death his realm fell into instability as his sons fought over their father's kingdom. And just as it seemed as if that realm would find peace and stability, once again united under a single king, another event in 1120 brought instability again, years of instability that would give rise to the House Plantagenet, which would rule England until 1485. It was a disaster that reverberates throughout history, one of those moments upon which history turns. The tragedy of the White Ship is history that deserves to be remembered. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings, William spent years completing the Norman conquest of England and fighting both on the continent and in England against foes both foreign and domestic. He faced revolts by the recently conquered, raids by the Danes, opposition from the French king and the would-be English king Edgar Atheling. William the Conqueror died in 1087 while on campaign in France, at the age of 59. William had 3 surviving sons at his death. The eldest was Robert, followed by William II, and the youngest, Henry. The practice of giving the kingdom only to the eldest son was not well entrenched at the time, and William followed an earlier tradition that split the kingdom between his heirs. Robert received the lands that William had gotten from his own father, Normandy. William II, also called William Rufus, received the newly conquered kingdom of England. Henry received money and some of his mother's holdings in England. But as still can happen today, immediately the heirs started fighting over their father's inheritance. Both Robert and William II immediately started preparing for war against each other, each seeking to claim the other's part of their father's kingdom. Henry, youngest of the 3, was caught in the middle. He initially stayed in Normandy with Robert, likely because Robert extorted him by threatening to withhold the monetary part of his inheritance. Taking advantage of the situation, William II seized the holdings meant for Henry in England. Henry supported Robert with money in exchange for becoming a count, but Robert didn't trust Henry and soon had him arrested, convinced by an advisor who thought Henry was conspiring with William. He was released, but did not receive the countship back. When William helped instigate a rebellion by a noble in Normandy in 1090, Henry supported Robert, and it was Henry's forces that won the day. He had the rebellious noble killed by tossing him off a castle. Henry gained significant fame for his actions in the battle, which only made Robert jealous. In repayment for protecting his realm, Robert banished Henry from Normandy, most likely because Robert felt Henry was becoming too popular, but possibly because Henry pressed his brother to give him back his title of count. In 1091, William Rufus invaded Normandy with an army large enough to convince Robert to give up his claim on the English throne. Instead, both vowed to support each other's claims to their own lands and named each other as heirs, specifically leaving Henry out of the succession of either country. Both of the brothers then turned on Henry, taking control of his lands in Normandy. But politics in the High Middle Ages were never static, and William and Robert started fighting again. This time Henry sided with William, who supported Henry in taking his lands back to weaken Robert. Henry became a fixture at William's court. They even campaigned together. Robert then decided to go to the Holy Land and participate in the First Crusade in 1096. But by then he was so impoverished from all the fighting that he was forced to mortgage his duchy to William to afford joining the crusade. On August 2nd, 1100, William was hunting when he was killed by an arrow. While William had many enemies, and some, particularly Henry, had much to gain from his death, most chroniclers at the time accepted that it was a simple hunting accident. Though conspiracy theories have abounded in the centuries since his death, historians have generally discredited those theories, as injury or death during a hunt was fairly common. Still, Henry would benefit significantly from that errant arrow. Henry moved quickly to seize his brother's throne, occupying Winchester Castle and taking control of the royal treasury. He was crowned 3 days later. Robert was still returning from his crusade and was in no place to press his own claim. Henry announced that he would correct many of his brother's unpopular policies, specifically William's treatment of the clergy and abuses of barons' property rights. To help secure his power, he also married Matilda of Scotland, daughter of the late King Malcolm III of Scotland and descendant of the West Saxon kings and Alfred the Great. Henry and Matilda had 2 children, a son named William Adelin, and a daughter who they also named Matilda. In addition, Henry, now King Henry I, had a number of illegitimate children with various mistresses. When Robert returned, he tried to press his claim to the English throne, but Henry had consolidated power by then. Henry easily beat back an invasion by Robert in 1101, and then Henry invaded Normandy, and in 1106 defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray, and Robert was captured. While he didn't take the title of Duke for several years, he held Robert as a prisoner and administered Normandy, effectively controlling all of his father's former kingdom. The decades of war between the siblings following the death of William the Conqueror seemed to have come to an end at last. Although he seemed the least likely of the 3, it was Henry who outlasted his brothers and consolidated his father's lands under a single ruler. And these lands that had seen so many years of war finally saw the prospect for peace and stability. Henry's rule is generally considered effective, as he maneuvered politically to strengthen his friendships and eliminate troublesome barons, eventually reconstructing the government to more fully rely on himself as king. Problems remained as other forces, such as the French king, Louis VI, threatened over control of the Norman duchy, as did another Norman neighbor, Fulk, Count of Anjou. But the politically adept Henry won Fulk's support by promising to have his son, William Adelin, marry Fulk's daughter, yet another Matilda. Henry continued to squabble with Louis VI until they reached an agreement in 1120, in which Louis accepted William Adelin as the rightful heir to the Duchy of Normandy, in exchange for William Adelin's homage to the French crown. Finally, everything seemed to be going Henry's way. His kingdom was largely secure, and no one had risen against him in England in years. He had humbled or allied with the major powers surrounding Normandy, and his heir at 17 was already helping to rule England with the assistance of advisors. He was even called Rex Designatus, or King Designate. Despite being called by one chronicler a prince so pampered that he would be destined to be food for the fire, he seemed to be meeting Henry's expectations. We know relatively little about Adelin, but he seemed to have been the center of a relatively hard-partying group of young nobles, as might be expected from a teenage heir. He married Matilda of Anjou in 1119. In 1120, Henry and William Adelin were sailing from France to England from the port of Barfleur. Barfleur was Henry's favorite place to sail from France to return to England, and offered a fairly safe, easy trip of 10 to 12 hours. In Barfleur, King Henry was approached by a captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, the son of a man who had been captain of the flagship of William the Conqueror's 1066 invasion fleet. Thomas was the owner of a large ship called the White Ship, and wished to have the honor of taking Henry across the Channel to England. But Henry had already made other arrangements, though he did consent to allow Thomas and his ship to take William Adelin across, along with a large number of other nobles, including several of Henry's illegitimate children. One chronicler quoted Henry, "Your request meets my approval. I have indeed chosen a fine ship for myself, and will not change it. But I entrust to you my sons William and Richard, whom I love as my own life, and many nobles of my realm." Henry left early that evening, expecting Adelin and the White Ship to follow shortly after. According to the contemporary chronicler Orderic Vitalis, hard-partying William supplied the nobles and the crew of the ship with a considerable amount of wine prior to their departure. Perhaps sensing disaster, several members of the party chose not to sail, saying that they found the ship overcrowded with riotous and headstrong youths. Others left the ship as they were ill or because they were concerned about overcrowding, including one of William's cousins, Stephen of Blois. The White Ship was described as a square-sailed timber longboat, She was recently refitted and one of the fastest and most modern ships in the fleet. The party may have delayed leaving because they were confident the fast ship would bring them quickly to English shores. Vitalis claims that by the time they left, the ship was carrying some 300 passengers. In addition to the heir, one of the most powerful earls was aboard as well, the Earl of Chester, and many of his associates. At least 7 chroniclers recorded what happened next. Chronicler William of Malmesbury describes a group of priests arriving to bless the ship, common practice at the time, but they were chased off by the drunk revelers. He goes on to say that the crew began bragging that they could overtake the king's ship, and the passengers egged them on. A large crowd had gathered to watch the ship leave, sometime a little before midnight. Drunk and proud, the ship took off in the middle of the night, swifter than the winged arrow, sweeping the rippling surface of the deep, and straight into a rock just offshore. The ship was struck on the shallow rocks, and the crew attempting to free it using hooks, but as soon as the ship began to break away, so went the ship's hull, and it immediately began to sink. The crowd on the beach heard a cry go out, though there was little they could do, and most assumed it was merely the sound of the party on board. On the chilly November night, the passengers had little chance of survival. Dressed in thick, heavy clothing, drunk, very few of them would have known how to swim even in good conditions. The cold would likely have struck the struggling lords and ladies with cold water shock, which can cause immediate and involuntary inhalation, filling the lungs with water. It also constricts the body's blood vessels and makes it difficult to coordinate muscles. Most of the unfortunate victims would have died quickly. But there was at least a single rowboat aboard, and bodyguards quickly found the heir and deposited him inside. He and a very small number of people may have escaped, except that William heard the cry of one of his half-siblings on board, and began shouting at him about how awful it would be to leave his sister to die. William ordered the ship to return for her, and between the water and the struggling passengers, the little boat was overturned. William, his bodyguards, and his sister all drowned. 12th century historian Henry of Huntingdon wrote that William, instead of ascending a lofty throne, found his grave at the bottom of the sea. According to Vitalis, the captain was still alive when he learned that William had drowned, and instead of facing the king, chose to allow himself to drown as well. Vitalis wrote that the passengers and crew raised cries of distress, but their mouths were soon stopped by the swelling waves, and all perished together. We only know about the details of what happened after the crash because a single man survived. According to Vitalis, he was a butcher from Rouen called Berold. He clung to wreckage all night and was eventually rescued. The news spread quickly, but no one wanted to tell Henry. The king was rare in that he had recognized a number of his illegitimate children, and along with William, 2 of them had also died in the wreck. When the news finally did reach Henry, he was overcome. So sudden was the shock, so severe his anguish, that he instantly fell to the ground, but began raised up by his friends. He was conducted to his chamber and gave free course to the bitterness of his grief. The sorrowful king mourned for his sons, the flower of his nobility, and his principal barons. His son's death may have inspired Henry's construction of Reading Abbey, in its time one of the largest royal monasteries in Europe. Everything that Henry had built began to fall apart. He had no heir, and his wife had died several years earlier. With William dead, the alliance with Fulk of Anjou disintegrated, although his daughter-in-law remained at his court for many years. The peace with King Louis also died with the heir, and Henry was again embroiled in conflict and desperate for a solution to succession. He married a second time in 1121, but by the time of his death in 1135, failed to produce another heir. In 1125, Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor and husband to Henry's other legitimate child Matilda, died. Henry brought the empress home and declared her his heir, forcing his barons to pledge their allegiance to her. Matilda was married to Geoffrey, Fulk of Anjou's oldest son. Henry's attempts to salvage the situation, however, were all for naught. When he died in 1135, many of his barons turned immediately to Stephen of Blois, another grandson of William the Conqueror, who had so nearly died in the sinking of the White Ship. Crowned King Stephen, the next years were a long string of conflicts for most of 2 decades between Matilda and Stephen, in a civil war called the Anarchy. Many chroniclers spake ill of William Adelin, describing him as spoiled or insufficient religious or generally bad-tempered, but the truth of those stories is difficult to determine because it was common practice at the time for chroniclers to think up excuses for why God would allow something like the tragedy of the sinking of the White Ship. Some conspiracy theories have risen in the 900 years or so since the ship sank, but generally historians discount ideas that the ship might have been deliberately sabotaged, mostly because there's no good way that the ship could have been sunk deliberately without the saboteurs themselves being killed. Regardless, the sinking was a pivotal moment that would direct the course of English history. Eventually, after a bloody 18 years of war over the throne, Matilda and Geoffrey's son Henry II became king, beginning the rule of the House of Anjou over England, and the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry I was one of the most effective rulers of his time, but despite all his careful preparations for the future, history dashed his hopes upon rocks just off the coast of France. In 2021, divers found some wreckage near those rocks that appeared to be those of the White Ship. The chronicler William of Malmesbury wrote, "No ship that ever sailed did England such disaster."
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, discuss what might have happened if it had all gone a little differently. So we are talking today about a single disaster, and in some ways, just one ship. You could call it small scale, but what it ended up costing and the changes that it ended up causing were anything but small scale. And I think this is a really interesting place to talk about what could have happened, because this seems like an absolute freak accident that happened to take out an important person at an important moment.
It is. This is a very good example of a counterfactual. Though I think at the start you have to say, this might have not meant anything. In that we're talking the 12th century, right? So William's boat could have gotten there fine. He got off and died of dysentery the next day. I mean, there's not the only way he could have kicked off. If he died without heir, then it was his sister's son that eventually became the king. So that we might have ended up on the same path anyway without. So there's there's reasons to say we don't necessarily know what would have happened, but it certainly on face the loss of the only legitimate heir to the throne, which we really never found another straight legitimate heir to the throne, ends up being a radical difference, or making at least potentially a very radical difference in the history of England. All the stuff that you kind of think about England, whether that's Richard Lionheart or the War of the Roses or the Tudors or any of that all comes after this. And that, there was all a different line, and the 100 Years' War. And so, this comes early enough in English history that pretty much most of what you've seen on, the BBC in a dramatized series comes after this, and, potentially with a whole different royal family.
Yeah, definitely. And, just with the sheer amount of development that was taking place during this period, it looked as if Henry I was actually getting ready to put together a stable, long-term, potentially multi-generational dynasty that would have been active and flowering at a time when what we consider to be France today was just totally fractious and was in no way, shape, or form taking shape into what we would call in modern day France. Instead, it was a lot of regions, the Burgundians, the Avignians, and a whole lot of other regional areas that I'm sure I will mispronounce badly because my French is horrible.
But so the premise there is it's possible that England ends up conquering France, and those end up remaining a single kingdom. And what would that mean into the later centuries?
Yeah, and even
there's a lot in that. Yeah,
even
a lot
if
to unpack.
Yeah, even if France continues, eventually you get the Capetian dynasty, and they eventually get it together and are able to challenge the English. How much longer does England Normandy hold out? Does it hold out until the 15th century?
Yeah, or because Henry II marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, that begins the whole claim that the English make to the throne of France and the 100 Years' War and all of that. So is it possible, if you remain with the Norman dynasty, that they remain a vassal of France and hang on to Normandy, and that there's always a cross-channel kingdom there, England and Normandy? So there's all sorts of different ways that could work out. But because to some extent it decreases the English claim to France, because a lot of that was made through Henry II. But in some extent it maintains a claim there because the Normans had a very strong claim to Normandy. It could completely change the whole geography of Europe. And if it did, if England and Normandy were one kingdom and remained one kingdom, how would that have changed things as we rolled into the 20th century and the wars of the 20th century? or at least all the wars between England and France in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and the wars of Austrian succession and all that came as a result of the territory that they had.
Yeah, this is an incredible period. That the anarchy, as they called it, that is a heavily debated term, if it's an appropriate term. But this was a term where, or a period of history where the English could have been stabilizing, and instead we had complete destabilization. They essentially had to deal with each other and each other only for decades.
Well, and how much of that was inevitable? I mean, because you get the 100 Years' War, you get the Barons' Wars, and then that will eventually turn into the War of the Roses, and does all of those civil wars come out of just this dynasty that follows after this. So, I mean, and that's an interesting question. Is it that chaos was just going to reign no matter who was king? Or was this where the chaos started and led us into these, years and years of just constant civil war? Because, obviously, Henry's sons then under Eleanor, Richard and John, are always rebelling against them. So you got all that civil war, and that falls into Barons' Wars. And then the king loses power with John and the Magna Carta and all that. That's all following this dynasty. So had the Norman dynasty hung on, or at least had William become king and been a good enough king to continue to stabilize power, and had he had a legitimate heir, I mean, would there still have been all this violence, because that's just kind of what you did in the 12th and 13th century, or would it have been a stable England at a time when unstable other countries in Europe could have been a huge difference in the power structure?
Yeah, there was, there had not been a peaceful transfer of power since William the Conqueror. His sons, every time someone died, there was a fight over it. And so would this have been the first time that they didn't fight, or was it doomed to be a fight anyway?
Which way, which comes to another question, and that is that the fight that did come, one of the primary people on that at that fight, because it was a fight between Stephen and Matilda, and Stephen was supposed to be on the boat. So, I mean, were it not for Stephen having a tummy ache, then how much would that have changed? I mean, there are other claimants, and he had brothers and all sorts of stuff. But what if one of the two, the guy that actually became the next King, Stephen, what if he had died on the boat too? I mean, how much would that have changed events?
Yeah.
He was at the right place.
Yeah, and I also think that without Stephen, I do think that there's at least a small chance that maybe Matilda is able, with the lack of a really solid claimant, to become the first Queen of England.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen happened to be well placed.
I think it's possible.
The death of Henry, and that allowed him, to be in a position where he could take. And of course, you have to suspect a little bit when there's this disaster and the heir dies, and this other guy that is a claimant to the throne just happened to not hop on a boat that day. And there have always been some rumors that there was some sort of, plot involved in the sinking of the White Ship. If oops, I didn't get on the boat. No, the other guy died. No, I'm going to claim to be king now. That's quite a story, right?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of interesting potential dark ops moments, if you will. Henry's father, of course, dies in a hunting accident, which is not unheard of. Hunting at that time was not exactly what we think of it as, six guys in a pickup truck drinking beer, finding the deer in the cornfield, and bringing home dinner. It really is a riding through the underbrush, trying to make sure that you don't get knocked off your horse. It's certainly not it's not necessarily a safe and pleasant adventure. It is certainly certainly there's a lot more going on during hunting at this time, and the fact that people are taking shots at noise in the underbrush. That's
well, and that being suspicious, it takes us, if you want to say, had the boat not sunk, then William would have solidified power and been a great king. Or had Stephen gone down with the boat, then Matilda might have taken power and been a great queen. Or is it that, you were just never going to have peace around that kind of power? There was always going to be a hunting accident waiting to happen. So it is, because now in terms of a revisionist history, for a long time that the idea was that this was just a terrible, terrible, violent time. And the kind of revisionist idea is to say, well, not really any more than everything else. To say that, maybe it wasn't an anarchy, it was just as violent as the century before and as violent as the century after. So
It does sound like some
mhm.
places were hit harder than others. There were some areas that were fairly devastated by the combat, and it seems like though that there were other places that were relatively untouched in terms of
Fine. And would there
destruction.
have been destruction? I mean, would there always have been some sort of? I mean, if the ship hadn't sunk, was Stephen at some point going to challenge William, or was Matilda going to challenge William at some point, or was there always going to be a fight?
Well, there were repeated
Absolutely,
rebellions
yeah.
throughout this whole thing. Some of them were fighting for, were choosing to fight on one side or the other. Plenty of them were battling either other local lords and barons and earls, or the
Hmm.
Welsh and the Scottish were both interested. East Anglia revolts. I mean, there were just rebellions all over the place. Were these people all going to do
Regardless,
that?
it is. I mean,
Regardless of.
historically, it's kind of hard to tell what was really part of the anarchy, which was the civil war between Matilda and Stephen, because there were so
Yeah.
many other revolts going on that might have been, unrelated to that, or
Yeah.
might have been, just kind of drawn into that.
Yeah.
And they certainly can speak to a part of the anarchy was that these other people were essentially taking advantage of the fact that the monarchs
Hmm.
couldn't pay attention to them. So they, but
Yeah. And now, you have some fallout from this during the anarchy, which is significant. And I think that it really plays back to the quote where the disaster of the single ship sinking was something that affected England as much as almost any event in history. First of all, the Welsh, if Henry and then the transition to his son William is a relatively smooth one, the Welsh probably do not take up arms. Secondly, Henry was masterful, I think, in making sure that by marrying the daughter of the King of Scotland, that he kept things along the northern border
yeah,
rather quiet. And David, the King of Scotland, does actively take part in trying to get Matilda onto the throne. So again, if William survives, then that friction does not occur. And this is at a time when, first of all, there's a little renaissance going on during the 12th century in Europe. Later on, you have quite a bit of trade, you have a lot of literary development, and then you begin to get the intellectual fallout of the First Crusade, where the participants in the Crusades were bringing home
Hmm.
literature, science, and a lot of other stuff that
So
uh, was far easier to pick up and
they
bring
brought
home
back
from someone
soap.
else than it is to do it
Yeah,
on your own.
there's so I mean, it's just a very dynamic time. That raised an interesting question too, and that is who might William have married, had he inherited, and what would that have meant?
well, he was married to Matilda of Anjou to begin with, right? But I mean that doesn't necessarily. I mean people died or divorced their wives in various ways all the time. Um, but that so that was still connections. I mean, this is a good example of how these early English kings were often more tied to France than they were to England. They much of what was going on had to do with dynastic maneuvering in England, and having Anjou was always a good idea, and of course ends up being what happens with Henry II and the so-called Angevin Empire is that this was powers based in Anjou, and so maybe that power would have maybe they still would have had that if William had lived, and that's still deep connections into France. Not quite as direct as Henry II, son of Geoffrey, who was in turn son of Fulk, who was king of Jerusalem for a bit. It's an interesting. These are all interesting characters who did important things. I mean, Anjou and Normandy was a big deal, and so the fact that I mean that's why they were so involved and so close to the throne of England. So maybe some of that power base remains no matter what. But I do really wonder. Does William spend his? I mean, does he end up spending all of his time in? And he was born in England, but does he end up spending all of his time in France anyway, and not focusing on
Yeah.
English affairs? It's hard to know because he died young. We have very little information about him. He had performed some regent
Was
tasks. He had done some of that. He had
But he was only
been
17, right? Obviously, he was a party
yeah,
guy. I mean, that's probably what happened on the boat.
yeah. But you never know. I mean, there's lots of kings who were young and stupid that end
Yeah,
up being decent
matured into great
administrators.
kings. Yeah.
Yeah,
But I mean, he might have been a lousy king. I mean, we honestly don't know. But I mean, the fact that he was the only heir really certainly does lead to a civil war in England, which might have been
yeah,
avoidable. And I mean, at the very least, even if in the end, Henry II still ends up becoming, king after
yeah,
his death. So that the best you can say is that we know that there was violence associated with his death.
hmm
That presumably, some of that violence, but it might have been replaced by other kinds of violence as well. But one of the kind of traditional arguments about the sinking of the White Ship is that what's really led to a modern England. I mean,
yeah.
that really led to a distinct English identity and an England that wasn't an England ruled from Normandy. And how much does that change, history overall over time? I mean, potentially quite a lot.
It might change on whether England is a center of power or kind of on the periphery of a
Yeah.
greater power.
Well, whether they were more power than they ended up being, or they were less power than they ended up
Yeah.
being, or potentially because there's always a claim, that the thrones of England and France end up together.
Yeah,
Especially spent centuries trying to figure that out.
yeah. I would say that yeah, a unified kingdom of France and England together is probably that's a bit of a stretch, I think. Very seldom do you see two ethnically different and linguistically different groups like this staying together for quite that long. Uh,
But if it had remained Norman England, then they might not have been as ethnically different, might not have been as culturally different.
But maybe there was a point where essentially you had to make that decision on whether you were going to be French or English because of those differences. And so as long as you were ruling from Normandy, uh, that made it difficult for you to keep England in line. And so eventually you had to kind of prioritize either your French lands or your English ones. And I mean, kind of what ends up happening because of this, they spend so much time focusing on England. It builds power bases there. It makes it so that, the Angevin kings focus more on their English holdings, that maybe that does mean that, this is an England that exists separate from the French
Right.
powers.
So if the White Ship hadn't sunk, I mean, what's the consequence if you delay that by one reign, potentially a long reign,
Hmm
or two reigns, or and we honestly don't know what his heirs would have been like either. I mean, it's
No idea on that.
and because we know we know what happened with the other line, and there was a lot of mess in there. I mean,
Yeah.
Richard, who went on crusade, essentially abandoned them and then impoverished the kingdom when he was captured coming back. Then he dies, leaves his son, or leaves his brother John. John is such a weak king that it ends up essentially destroying the power of the king and the Magna Carta and all this. So we know all that follows from this. So I mean, would it have been a stronger line,
Yeah.
through William?
And it's hard to know. I mean, that is the. But I do think, I actually think we could say that the Magna Carta was, I mean, a direct consequence of essentially of the crisis that happens when William Adelin dies, because
Mm-hmm.
the anarchy causes so much destruction that Henry II has to spend all of his time, trying to regain these powers and essentially having to step over lines. And I mean, he does that with the church because of the powers that the church has gained, which leads to Thomas
Thomas
Becket.
and Becket, that's true. Yeah, yeah.
Thomas and Becket, and that, and so because he had to, I mean, he had to do that to centralize. He had to do that to regain powers that they had simply lost during that period. That eventually, they're stepping over everything so much that leads to the barons saying, okay, we have to change this, and leads directly to the Magna Carta. Now, I don't know that means that without it you wouldn't have had some version of the Magna Carta, because I mean there were still problems with the simple fact that the kings were there was no system for reigning kings in if they were destroying the kingdom essentially, or stepping on the rights of various other powerful.
So with the
factions.
because modernization is going to occur. So would we have had the Barons' Wars anyway? Yeah, I mean, there's good reason to think that there was still going to be a restive aristocracy that was going to try to wrest some power away from the king. But I mean, that could be
Yeah.
completely different. Well, I mean, that would be completely different if Richard hadn't died, right? As a, as
Yeah.
opposed to John, more or less to say, what if we were going through heirs of the Norman line, as opposed to the new Plantagenet line, right?
And I do think that we also see something that is distinctly English that leads to this and continues to have impact, and that is the practice of primogeniture. The fact that at no the fact that England is not able to basically make a peaceful kingdom for itself simply by allowing all of the heirs to have a slice of the pie. This has impact that definitely sticks with us until this very
Hmm.
day. So there's a certain amount of stability there, and England stuck to their guns at a particular time when it was very important. I think it's also important to
Yeah.
point out that during this period that yeah, I do think that you're going to continue to have strife in England.
Hmm.
We At this point in time, you're still only 3 generations removed from
From
the
William, yeah.
wholesale conquering of the Saxonish kingdoms and peoples, as well as the Danes up in the Danelaw.
Hmm.
So, yeah, the fact that there are rebellions happening on a fairly regular basis is not unusual. And looking at France, it's the same way. Various regional powers are fighting against a central monarch in Louis VI, who basically at this point is uh, he is nowhere near a French king. He controls the 400 square miles around Paris and some other holdings. So yeah, I think that the anarchy to an extent is probably overplayed. However, it is something that we can at least identify that okay, these two armies were causing heartache and damage, death, destruction, leaving leaving wastes in their paths. But it was because of an identifiable cause, and that identifiable cause was the succession.
Yeah, the Civil War. Yeah. It's interesting too that there wasn't more involvement in the Civil War from other powers. I mean, eventually, I guess it was really ended because France supported Henry II. But I mean, it's interesting. This was not the War of Spanish Succession. This was not the War of Austrian Succession, where everybody on the continent decided they're going to decide who's going to be the king of this powerful state. I mean, this what comes earlier. But I mean, England has plenty of civil wars. I mean, when they continue to be having civil wars. So
Yeah.
here's an interesting question too. Yeah, if Stephen had been on the boat, or if he had died, if we really come up with the first queen, if we were able to actually make that stick, how does that change England? If England accepts a woman on the throne?
It's an interesting question because it was always hard. I mean, even Henry the First, does this whole thing where he's like, you have to swear fealty to her. That was always a questionable. I think even at the time, Henry knew that wasn't that hardly secured his kingdom for his daughter. But if she, I mean, does it lead to more queens, or is she able to, is she only able to continue that power because she relies on saying, oh, but I've got the help of my husband, or my son will be king next. It's I don't think there was a chance of like a line of queens, because I don't think that Matilda was going to say, okay, we're going to make my daughter
No, it's true.
queen
Yeah.
after me and not my son. But it still seems like if Matilda was able to become queen, solidify her position, that's got to change. If she's fairly successful, that would have some kind of impact on the whole historical view of what a queen
Because
could
that was a
be.
huge deal under the Tudors, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
there was a lot done because Henry VIII was desperately trying to have a male heir. So I wonder if you come to being able to accept a female heir, does that reduce strife later on when those are what your options are?
Yeah, maybe if you trust that a woman could potentially run the kingdom with some success, then maybe it's not. It has to be a son or nothing.
Yeah, and yes, as yeah, there will definitely be periods in English history where the lack of a male heir, um, if a precedent had been set with Matilda, And even if it were some sort of a watered down, where she is where she is a more or less a powerful regent until said male heir comes of age. Then there are some times in English history where there were crises. Maybe those crises wouldn't have occurred. And I think that ultimately the White Ship, as well as some of the follow-on crises, really kind of hold England back from being a major power in European politics until several hundred years later.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that
Yeah, they do still remain a fairly minor power for a long time. But
if they were able to centralize it at this period, that might have been key for them, because you mentioned other powers not getting involved. I mean, they were all very. I mean, it's not like these powers didn't exist, but they all also had their own issues. I mean, there's a reason France could only be kind of involved, and I mean, we don't have much involvement from, say, the Holy Roman Empire or the Spanish or anyone further south or anything like that. But even anyone that would have been vaguely close and nearby. And so if you have an England that is able to solidify and more modernize decades before, that might make a significant difference in how those power centers for the next
and might that have
centuries.
prevented or caused other wars later on.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
certainly,
just because
certainly here, because it's when Henry marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, which leads to all sorts of rebellion by her sons. But I mean, that is the claim that England eventually makes on the throne of France. It leads to the 100 Years' War. And so if we're talking about preventing the anarchy, I mean, what if you prevent the 100 Years' War? And, how many lives does that change? How many people that died might have made a difference? How powerful or different would the power structure be between England and France if they didn't spend 100 years fighting, that conflict, which had a number of very devastating battles. I mean, the anarchy had one pitched battle, but I mean, the 100 Years' War had dozens.
Yeah, we're talking a war that absolutely bankrupted both kingdoms, which took away. I mean, it weakened royal powers, and it was defining in terms of how history would move on from that. And you're right. I mean, if you change that, because if you still have some power in France with, say, Normandy and Anjou, but if you don't have Aquitaine and you don't have that connection to the throne, that certainly makes the 100 Years' War look different, right? That's not it's not the same claim.
That was literally the premise, upon which the King of England says, "No, I should be King of France." And without that premise, do they ever make that challenge? On the other hand, do they maybe hang on to Normandy and still have it be an Anglo-Norman kingdom that is technically a vassal state of the King of France, or
it does seem like eventually that was going to bring some kind of conflict, because even here, Henry doesn't want to give fealty to the King of France, so he has William become the Duke of Normandy, so that he doesn't have to personally swear fealty to. So I mean, it's clear that there was going to be conflict there, but does that conflict look like the English king saying, "I should also be King of France," or something very, very different? Just like separating Normandy from the French crown would be a different thing than what they claimed in the 100 Years' War.
I think there's also some impact. Looking at some of the literary developments, this was one of the rabbit holes that I followed when I was doing some research on this. Just a few years later, basically at about 1170, you have Crétin de Troyes begins writing and putting out his Arthurian tales, which leads to a literary trend. So the Ascension de disgust, again, I'm pronouncing this horribly. Please be kind to me in the comments, people. And what we consider to be the modern Arthurian cycle. So all of the names that we are used to discussing when it comes to Arthur. So Percival, Galahad, Eric and Enid. These are literary accomplishments that with this author have decided to write about these particular tales in a France that perhaps was less capable, less successful from a trade perspective, because Troyes Well, it's very interesting. It really is a center of commerce. The trivial pursuit point that you can get for that, of course, is that the Troy ounce is from Troyes.
It's a good point that the Angevin Empire is, because of those huge connections, is able to stimulate trade, and that might have been very different without it. Arthur and all of that, and how that has impacted history, and how that is felt as if it was itself history.
Well, and the other great set of legends from the UK there, and it's the Robin Hood legends. Matter of fact, there are some of the early figures that might be Robin Hood start in this period, and of course those follow into the just 2 generations later with Richard and John.
Yeah.
I do have to say, and I really searched, and I can't really figure out a way that Bigfoot could have been involved. There are legends, of course, of green men in Wales. So if there were Bigfoots in England in this period, they were in Wales. Wild men of the West there. I never saw anything that suggested that the drunken helmsman was large and hairy. So
maybe the butcher.
Maybe the butcher was. I've always been able to work that in here. I don't know how Bigfoot really would have impacted the story. But on the other hand, I mean, part of the long term, and I think the Telegraph was actually talking about all the long term possibilities that come from this. One of the things that impacts it, because of the dynasties that we end up following, is eventual colonization of the United States, which is presumably where Bigfoots are. So I mean, this could, I mean, all of modern history. In the West, so much of that is tied to English history. So much of that is tied to the dynasty that follows this dynasty. And so you really can say we don't know if America would be the same if the White Ship hadn't sunk. If Canada would be the same if the White Ship hadn't sunk, because you have a whole different line of monarchs who made a lot of choices.
Yeah. Because every English monarch after Henry ties to Henry II, and so you could have changed that line completely. I think it would be easy to say, for instance, if William became king, that Elizabeth II never becomes queen.
Yeah,
it's as far off as it is. I don't know who would have been, but I think it would be easy to argue to say that not the people that were.
I mean, you can't even you can't follow that line because William didn't have any heir, right? But but I mean,
which you assume he would have if he lived.
It's such a peculiar story how the Tudors become monarchs. And that all requires the War of the Roses. That all is directly derived from what goes on under the White Ship. I mean, do we get all of the definite strange sets of consequences that lead to these significant civil wars in England, the significant war with France, the War of the Roses ends up devastating much of the aristocracy in England, and transform. I mean, the Tudors are an absolute shift in English history, but I mean they're all descendants of Henry II,
who might not have been king if not for
have been king.
Crash of the White Ship.
So I mean, the White Ship. There, you can see it a lot of different ways. But one of the arguments I saw is that we consider the ramifications and the number of people that died possibly in the Anarchy. You could consider the White Ship to be a more devastating maritime disaster than the Titanic. Others will simply say this was a tectonic shift in English history. And it's all counterfactuals. I mean, the implications can be from small to quite large because we are talking about the monarch of a great state.
Yep, and a state that remained great and that had a large impact on history afterward.
And that was clearly at a turning point. I mean, this is you could really say modern England begins. The path to modern England begins with the sinking of the White Ship.
And so the question does become, was some portion of how England developed in kind of the broad strokes, was that inevitable, or did it matter, who was king, when they were king, and how they got to be king? Because if you have to spend each generation, spending 2 decades fighting each other and generally causing chaos, then you can't focus on modernizing your state. You still move forward somehow. And ultimately, Henry II, despite the anarchy, did move the country forward. And so was that because Henry II was Henry II? Or was that because England was ripe for that at the time? And that was, as long as you had a fairly competent king, you would have been able to do a lot of the same stuff
is
that Henry was doing. Or did Henry have to do it because of what happened in the
that's the
Anarchy?
biggest question when it comes to counterfactuals and the great man theory and that sort of thing, is how much of this was the result of one personality who went down with a boat. And can lead you to that question: what if Hitler had been 17 and his boat sank? Right. So how much of this is one personality?
What if that guy had shot him at the end of World War
What
I?
what if instead of getting one ball blown off, it was just like 6 inches higher, and that was that, right? So it does lead to that interesting question in terms of and this is a good example to say a lot of these events seem to be just part of the way that the history was progressing at the time. And then, of course, that we're going to get some version of the Barons' War. We're going to get some version of the Magna Carta. We were going to have some version of the Anarchy, no matter who was king, because they were all shooting at each other forever, all that time anyway, fighting with each other. So you could argue, it doesn't mean anything. And this is the good example of where one personality is just overcome by the force of history, or not. That's why we do this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, one of the questions that kind of popped into my mind when I was looking at some background on this was, does Wales continue to exist if William is able to take the throne, consolidate power, and continue his father's, grandfather's occupation, and ultimately do the Welsh cease to exist as a linguistic and cultural and ethnic group? Do they become totally integrated into England, and suddenly we do not get the street signs that apparently are 437 random characters pronounced in no way, shape, or form?
Lots of extra Y's in there. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because Henry tried to do that. I mean, Henry tried to essentially get rid of Welsh character and make it all just part of England. But I mean, if this happens, 6 generations, 7 generations ahead of that, then could it be that we really don't have a Welsh culture?
Well, and because the figures in Welsh history who fought here to keep at least part of Wales essentially independent throughout this period, they were important figures that were able to be rallied behind as kind of a cultural point. And if they don't exist, does that impact? And did that allow Welsh culture to kind of centralize and stay alive during this?
And then the other big question is, what about the Scots? Because the Scots, they're definitely an on again, off again source of irritation for the English.
During this, I thought one of the amazing things is during the Anarchy. I mean, they had control of all of Northumbria, and this is maybe a point where if they'd been able to hold on to that would have been a very different. I guess that's kind of a different counterfactual, but we could be looking at a different Scotland.
More peaceful? Because what is it? Grandson of Henry is Edward Longshanks, right? The Hammer of the Scots. Is he's just one or two generations? I'd have to go back and look and count monarchs, but it's not too far that descendants of Henry II, actually began the large conflict with the Scots that eventually ends up essentially in the conquest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can say that at least during this period, after the White Ship and into the Anarchy, that the Scots, I don't think were going to come into England if it had been anyone else but Matilda who had been proposed as the heir to Henry.
It's true, that connection.
Yeah.
That connection mattered.
Which does, once again, go back and prove that Henry I was one of the greatest kings of England.
I think he was an extremely important one. And I think it's valuable that he had as long a rule as he did, and that it took, there's a 15-year period between when William dies and when he dies and the succession crisis happens. And there are weaker kings who, when their heir died and it became obvious that he wasn't able to produce another one, that there are places in history where that literally meant that his the king's authority collapses, and the fact that it didn't, I think speaks
so of
well.
Of course, one of the primary jobs you've always had as a monarch of England is to spit an heir.
Yeah, which he was unable to do, although he had so many illegitimate children. I was going to say that to some extent, if this was going to be the peaceful the first peaceful transition of power, it's because there was only one legitimate heir. But there were enough illegitimate heirs that might have always been an issue. And ultimately, Stephen's even a little more removed from that because he's a nephew instead of an illegitimate heir. But certainly there were lots of other people who could have had some claim, and it wasn't all that clear. We get an idea, I think a lot of people get an idea in the modern world that there was always a really obvious heir, and that, it was always going to be the firstborn son, and we're really in a period where that wasn't necessarily true, and that there were other people who had plenty of a claim that would have been taken just as seriously.
Well, I mean, look at Henry the First himself. Yeah. He's the he was the 8th child.
Yes, he was the son of William the Conqueror, right? So he was just the youngest of the which all the kings between William and him were also brothers of various and that causes the issue, is that there's always and that happens again with John Lackland, right? Eventually enough of his older brothers die or are king, and that he becomes king. And so it was easy for someone who, they literally called him Lackland because they're like, oh, he's not going to have anything, he's too far down the line. and then there he popped up. So, and that's essentially what happens with Henry too. And so there was always, and they fought over it, every one of those brothers fought before they got to that point.
It's another episode, but the strange sequence of events that brought Victoria to the throne are just bizarre. The daughter of the dead 5th son.
Yeah. Another thought that was occurring to me that unfortunately is probably an episode of its own, but how is all of this affected by the backdrop of the Crusades?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much so. They all talked about going on crusade. Yeah. And of course, Richard goes on crusade.
That also brings up a possible counterfactual that's more focused on the topic that we're covering tonight. What if William survives somehow, is crowned, becomes King of England, and then promptly decides that he's going to be like his distant descendant, Richard III, and go off on crusade? Is it possible that he gets himself killed? Or is it possible that he comes back with accolades and honors and thereby cements an even more solid claim for England to, at the very least, the Norman territories?
What if he actually led a successful crusade? That changes the rest of the world. Yeah, a crusade under a good leader at the right time could still change geography of the world today. Yeah, that would have been Richard the First, though, right? Richard III was during the War of the Roses.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, I'm thinking. Yeah. Richard Coeur de Lion.
Yeah, Coeur de Lion.
Yeah. There, that may actually have been a relatively accurate pronunciation of French words. Right, so
don't worry, the people will complain about your pronunciation any which way.
Now, here's another question: who else was going to intervene into the affairs of the English succession? And I cannot think of anyone who's really capable at this point. Obviously, the King of Denmark, less than 100 years earlier, had put a colony essentially on English soil. But after Stamford Bridge, things get awfully quiet in the Danelaw.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. Well, if they didn't take advantage of the anarchy, then what would they have done? Differently here.
Yeah, that is interesting that we didn't see any. It's because it's not like it had been all that long since there was intervention there, and it doesn't seem like there was really any, not from what I looked at, that there was any real suggestion that there would have been. And what does that change? And it's part of it. As we've often talked about with this, it's difficult to know some of the details. But I think that when we're talking about counterfactuals, the goal is to see what we can suggest from what we know that did happen. And there certainly was evidence that there could have been an intervention there, and why wasn't there? That's a different question, I suppose. But
I think that you would also see England, if England had been able to get its act together with the with a more or less peaceful succession. Does England decide that, there are other parts of Europe that are ripe pickings, that are only a very short boat ride away? And do we see the English become involved in the Low Countries, because at this
I
point,
mean, so
Flanders is a
certainly they're
major
willing to
player
go
at
into
this point.
Ireland, right? So, I mean, why not? I mean, I guess you could say that if England solidifies more quickly, then, I mean, it could mean anything from like the Faroe Islands to, you're right. I mean, the Low Countries, I mean, and which they had connections with later, right? So, what if they take what if they take part of, what would become Holland? What if they take, what if they attack Denmark? And is there a possibility that you have other English influence elsewhere on the continent? It's not outside possibility.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the unification of France in the several hundred years that follow is basically the core of the French kingdom being able to put down the influence of the regions that essentially are in constant revolt. So Avignon, Burgundy, obviously Normandy. At that point, of course, it's English. Flanders. Yeah, I do think that I think that an ascendant England at this period in time definitely eclipses France and guarantees a much more English-centric High Middle Ages.
Yeah, I mean, so any power at this time changing it could be quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we'd be stuck without Gothic architecture because that is definitely a French thing.
That's true, and that's that impact on architecture. I wonder what we would have had in place of it. I don't know enough about it to say, well, if there was some nascent architecture movement in England that could have become ascendant, but it's certainly a possibility.
At this point, it is interesting that so much of what we assume from Middle Ages, the stone keep is still a relative rarity at this point in time. Certainly in
only
England.
A handful.
Yeah,
only a handful of them in England. I was looking at. They were almost all wooden Mott and Bailey stuff that is still what they were doing.
Yeah, and again, this speaks to the fact that again we're talking about we are only we're less than 60 years from the from William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror did not conquer England overnight. He took basically it took his line a couple of generations before they were finally able to really centralize and solidify power to the point that you could consider them English, as opposed to Wessex, Northumbria, Scotland.
Yeah, he took the throne quickly, but that didn't necessarily mean that he had a kingdom. Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow the History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.